We have stated it is.
Thank you, Ally. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. Just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, only the presentation part, however, we'll stop the recording when we get into the conversation piece. All right, so this is an ambitious task that we have here to try to give the history of Duluth urban planning in 20 minutes and place it in with urban planning in general. So we'll see how well I stick on time and how many liberties I end up taking with everything, but here we go. So thanks for being along for the ride. We're off to a great start. There we go. Okay, so we'll start on a higher level here. Think about what really makes a city a city. How do these things be? And there are a lot of things that go on here. So one is just the legal reality. There's state legislation enables the different municipalities to organize themselves, and these things have come to form over time, often along the boundaries of townships, which is what the U.S. government divided this chunk of the country into many years ago. The cities also sometimes annex neighboring townships, cities over time, so they can grow. Different states that's easier than other states. So there's a lot of different legalese that you can get really lost in the official boundaries of the city, but that's the backbone there. Often cities will follow geographic barriers. It's very obvious in Duluth. You have lakes, you have certain rivers, you have other things that are kind of constraining the geography of a city. It's some human barriers. Sometimes you get roads that get put in and become the boundaries. You have these utility areas, which they may not be the actual physical boundary of the city, but there's only development within the area where you can actually have water and sewer and so on. Cities are often hubs of economic activities. They'll generate their own little economies, and this gets you into broader discussion about what's a metro area, the areas look like there, but schools often, but not always, share boundaries with cities. You have this idea of the culture of a city and character of a city, so the shared history, these blurrier pieces of what the city can be that are much harder to measure or track, but you associate certain cultures with certain cities. People will often know what you're talking about in a way that they may not know some of the more basic legal facts. So that's certainly a piece of what goes into that idea of the city. And basically, for about as long as there have been cities, there's been at least some concept of urban planning, which is the idea of how you're going to shape the design, land use, and whole built environment of the city. So ancient cultures had some of this going on, got to the Greeks, the Romans, and so on. Colonial powers did a lot of this as they across the world. Spanish, whatever else they did, were very good at organizing cities. So quite a few things there. And the field of urban planning, though, really started to form in the 19th century, when cities started going through industrialization, started growing much more rapidly than they had in the past, and there's really a need or perceived need to address some of the issues that came up there. So things like public health crises, dealing with overcrowded or slumber tenement housing, and so there's this real movement to try to formalize things, change things, make more plans. And so urban planners are accused of many things. They touch so many different areas of work. So sometimes they're accused of being slaves to developers, sometimes they're the evil state taking over. So it's really the whole spectrum, which somehow gets involved in that. So a lot of different things going on in urban planning. And it's something that touches almost everyone's lives in ways whether they realize it or not. And usually when they realize it's because something has followed them. Complicated field. So we're all through a history of Duluth, and really the first era of planning is kind of the Wild West phase, when the city, as we think of it today, was first formed. Of course, there were people here already. There were indigenous populations in the Duluth area. There were a series of settlements, and many of the first white settlements were then also adjacent to those, so were coming in to trade, basic things. And this is a case where people kind of marched in and created their own city. When, in Duluth's case, people dug the canal that would have created the access to the harbor here. Duluth would not have been what it is if not for that man-made ship that happened in the late 1800s. And as people came in, houses went up, and it was a fairly formal structure. And in fact, this compilation of 11 original townships that were once in this area. So the labels in red were different townships. See, many of them are clustered in what is now downtown Duluth, the central area there. Some of the names are still familiar. So Fond du Lac is still Fond du Lac on there. And you'll still see names like there's a New London Cafe out on Lakeside. There's Portland is, you see the Portland Malt Shop, there's Portland Squares. There are little pieces of this that are left over, but a lot of these names are gone. I don't think anyone ever these days refers to Bilton or College Edition or North Duluth. It's just gone. But all those things were put together at one point and formed into the city as it is today. So there was this early phase where just a lot of people were slowly coming in, but this is of course happening at the same time that urban planning as a field is taking off. And so you get this era of people really thinking huge thoughts about how to create a city. And I threw Paris on here because I think a lot of people think of Paris as this historic and lovely city, but really when you look at the Champs-Elysees and all these nice avenues, there were all creations in the 1800s. They punched all these avenues through old neighborhoods, through old slums, and people try to do that today. The reaction to be but now we look at this and this beautiful city that was very well organized. There it is. And so it's a totally different era. And that movement to really beautify these cities, have these big monumental squares and buildings that really came across the US too. Probably most famous in the World's Fair, it was in Chicago in the late 1890s, was meant to build that up. And the architect who was behind that, Daniel Burnham, had a project in Duluth. He is the architect of Old City Hall, courthouse, federal building that had made plaza right downtown. So a little piece of that did show up in Duluth. Things have changed a little bit since then. We've taken out a couple of fountains and put in more building and lots of parking. And that little avenue up there is, I'm not sure if that was ever a thing, but I think it would have gone straight through Zach's house. But it's so there's at least the start of this grandiose scale of architecture that was sort of laid out here, especially at the turn of the century when it looked like Duluth might be on this trajectory to be a huge great American city. And as the city really expanded out from there too, so you start getting these streetcar lines, and really by 1910, 1920, the basic footprint of Duluth already existed, and the same neighborhoods are basically built up because they have all these streetcar lines going all the way up east and west and the hill of it and connecting different neighborhoods. You had private companies building a ton of housing too. The Morley Heights Edition was built by Marshall Wells Company. You have Morgan Park out west, built, named after J.P. Morgan, the steel mill. And so these planned developments going in all over the place. And then there was also some more radical things going on too, like this idea of the home crop city, this movement to give everyone a plot of land where they'd be able to farm, be self-sufficient, and have all their own food. And that's some of those lots are still existing up in the Woodland neighborhood, and it's still called Home Crop Elementary School. So that legacy is still around in some places too. And I think it's also important to talk about history here too, and certain historical events that deeply shaped the course of the community. Think about something like lynching of 3 Black men in 1920, which I think dramatically reshaped the demographics of the city, made it a scary place to be for a lot of people, and that certainly shaped its trajectory over the next 50+ years too. Now we go to planning era 3, which I'll sort of broadly call the liberal stage. So this is sort of starting in the 1930s, coming out of Great Depression, New Deal era, really this huge era of government investment in cities, new construction projects, massive infrastructure projects, and kind of building a lot of the backbone of country as we see it today. The poster child for this is Robert Moses of New York, so he's got a picture here from up here, but and this really is an era that is in some ways controversial now, and we'll get into a little bit of that, but it was an era where a lot got done. The interstate highway system came along in the 50s, came all the way into Duluth, and you have these massive construction projects, massive bridges going up, huge investment in the infrastructure of the city. That's going on, and then also coming out of New Deal programs, you really have different ways of thinking about housing too. Before the Great Depression, it was not a common thing to get a fixed rate, long-term mortgage. Concept didn't really exist, so the government created programs to enable these, and then they created a corporation that sort of set the framework for how they were going to draw up the city and where they thought loans would be safe to make. So the government used all these maps. An example of one from Duluth in the 1930s that was just sort of showing where banks can make loans for new housing. And so as you can see, they're classifying the city into these green, blue, yellow, and red areas on the spectrum of how safe they think it is for lending. And it's where the phrase redlining paper comes from, these red areas where they just no-go zones for new loans. And they particularly note identified these areas, and they write some comments about them too, which we should have, and you can dig into this a little bit. So you get things like New Heights, now still relatively well off from the city, but says that section has been stagnant for 25 years, praise people, laborers, practically because of its cheapness and hill rent. So very blunt. That's what they said about that neighborhood. This neighborhood we'd probably call it Oneota. It's kind of down under Denfeld. A lot of it is now freeway. See in many cities, the places that were in red areas were the places where they put freeways. It's fairly easy to follow through those. And you'll see a lot of local language in these two. Foreigners predominate in this section. But where there are immigrants, that's where I'll do that. Similar things in Gary and New Duluth. At the time, Duluth was about 97% white. So, but yet, where there are Black people, they identify them. That makes an area red. And so that's showing up here. But despite the class treaty occupants, there's a high regard for the home ownership among the foreigners in this area. So you see some of the language here. It's something. And, so those are some of the red areas. Yellow area, well, there are Italians there, so I guess we're a little higher up on spectrum here. But still old and shabby. This is the Indian neighborhood, sort of between 14th and 21st Avenues East. I'm amused by this one because I rented a house here for a while, and it's some of the older homes here are being declining, but being transformed into smaller apartments, duplexes, and still we're complaining about that when I was there. In reality, that's been happening for 90 years, but it's going on. But that area is still blue. And again, this isn't necessarily destiny of how neighborhoods are now. The couple areas in the cities that were green, or some of them are probably pretty predictable. If we put it now as Congdon, a bit of lakeside, some there, but there's also Denfeld area was green. And they have these glowing words about these salaried persons from the nearby industrial plants. This is especially man of the west end of the city. Fairly recently constructed with the houses there, very choice living territory. So, and it's sort of interesting now to layer this map, like up against the map of family income in Duluth now. So you sort of see the differences. And in many cases, this thing's kind of map on. The urban side is still generally lower. These guys generally wealthier bits, but there are some exceptions. So I mentioned Blue Heights, now fairly wealthy up there, was red. Park Point was red, now fairly wealthy. The lakeside that was declining, that's now fairly wealthy. So something's changed. And if you look at the language there for a trend, like anywhere where it mentions anything about a foreigner or Black people or anything like that, the places that have stayed for where there's no mention of that, you've seen things rise. It's fascinating. All right. Move on to arrow number 4 here, which is to talk about urban renewal, the resistance to some of the planning trends that had happened previous 40 years. So here we have Jane Jacobs, who is famous for resisting some of the efforts of people like Robert Moses, who punched freeways through New York. So now these movements to stop the freeway, stop that planning can happen. You see environmental regulation. This is something for people in California, the CEQA regulations that went into place there. So you're really seeing this resistance to some of these projects that just came plowed through and went straight through communities, and maybe a little thought about the consequences. And this happened in Duluth too. So Duluth, freeway for the first many years of its construction, plowed straight down the hill, straight to downtown, and then things kind of stopped because there was some movement that started to build around, is this really the best choice to keep building a freeway all the way out to the far east side? And so there was resistance even starting in the 60s and 70s, and then eventually this led to this very large project to the freeway through tunnels on the east side, which at the time was very unique. It was something that was real innovation in urban planning. So that was a significant move that happened in Duluth. And then you're also seeing some of these plans to really completely revitalize the parts of the city too. Bell Park famously was a kind of a junkyard in the 80s, but almost around this time we found this in a back closet at Northspan. We found some of these old plans from that era, and this initial concept for what Bell Park would look like. And you see, some of these things didn't happen. There's no skywalk across the slip there. There's this big towering hotel on the deck here, where there's now a parking ramp. But something definitely did happen. And you look at the hotels along the lakefront there, the big park pieces, and sort of see how that initial vision, even if it doesn't look like the original concept, really did come along over time. So that was part of this era. Also, another big shift that really happened in this era was kind of rethinking housing and housing development as well. This is not really, this is actually in St. Louis, a project called Igo, which famously was this giant public housing project that went up in the 1950s, and by the 1970s, they were blowing it up. There are a lot of reasons for that. The time was held up as a poster child for why public housing was terrible. It's a bad investment, but now I think there's been more recognition over time that it was built very poorly from the start, so it's really set up to fail. And there's also a lot of other trends going on, ways of moving out, and a failure of a project for different reasons. And so with Duluth, while we didn't have any giant construction like that, there was still a lot of properties that were torn down. So this is a block on the west side of downtown, which district down has been called Bowery historically. And it was a somewhat rundown area, somewhat seedy area, the story that you'll read about it. But at the same time, there was a lot of housing there. A lot of people there, often in these single room occupancy situations. So maybe not nicest housing, so it was probably in very bad shape, but there were a lot of people there, a lot of delinquent people there. And that same block looks like this now. So it has changed dramatically. It's now the library, but that whole area is just really cleared out. And now when we're talking about tearing down the library, my librarian mother back and said, we're sad about it because this building is kind of architectural banking project and not terribly functional buildings. But you see this wave of urban renewal. There's this effort, sometimes enlightened, to try to clear out bad housing, sometimes less so, but this era of real change. It's also important to talk about what didn't happen in this era. So, of course, Duluth was not growing rapidly. It's going through some very difficult economic times. And in part, largely because of that, we did not get this giant suburban tract housing rolling out in all directions. If Duluth had kept growing the way it had been at the start of the century, we'd probably see, places like Town and Lakewood and Rice Lake would probably have 20, 30,000 people. And it was a little like that, but they don't. And that's significant. It means that there was never any really money to be made building at scale. So it had a lot of incremental changes to neighborhoods. Maybe you had one new block of houses, but you didn't have vast subdivisions. That meant that a lot of people had to reinvest in those older homes. And so it does have a stock full of homes. Some of them are in the best shape, but a lot of them are. So there's been a lot of effort put into that, and that's a unique thing. And at the same time, we've seen this process of these very large old streets. Things like London Road was the highway before there was a freeway, so we just sort of left with this legacy structure of a city that was built for 1,000 people. But we actually need the London Road here, which is what it was for a bit. Not really. So you're still seeing this process of kind of coping with some of this old construction. All right, now let's sort of move into the 90s and 2000s, more recent era. And this is where you start getting this movement called New Urbanism, which is focused on really kind of a micro level of urban planning and thinking about design and thinking about how can we make things look more attractive and appealing. This is a new public housing development in Duluth, and as you can see, they're trying to make it look like some very nice townhomes. It's not the big block we saw a few slides back. They're trying to make it somewhere that a person would want to live and be a little more attractive in that way. So there's a design movement at least going on here, and sort of recognizing these are some pictures from Europe of those streets that really, they're aesthetically pleasing. You have all this density around it. They're very walkable. You have these amenities that are really attractive here. And so there's a movement to start to do some of that in urban planning across the U.S. and in Duluth, where you start to see bits of it. Lincoln Park here, you're seeing a bike lane. You see some of this similar building style and trying to preserve some of that, turn it over right on the block right out here. But at the same time, this is, again, a very micro level effort. And so if you get population growth in the past 10 years in the Duluth metro area generally. And while all this is going on, most of the growth is still happening on the outskirts. It's expanding outward, not quickly, but it's happening. We're seeing both the permanent townships, Duluth Heights, Kenwood, and then the core neighborhoods, with some exceptions, tend to be declining in population still. So, which I think talks about to some of the challenges of development in Duluth, barriers that people face, and projects forward, and it's the parts reality of geography, which we kind of started on with this whole stuff. But look at a map of Duluth, that it's the land use map. So anything yellow is single family housing, lighter yellow, even less dense single family housing. So then the green areas are parks. So take out all that, it's not going to get any density in any of those, at least something for zoning structure. You're left with a few scattered areas, many of which are already built up to some extent. And certainly there's some areas where things can happen. There's a little bit out west here where you have this stuff. There's Leslie Park Golf Course, pencil there, but there's just not a lot of room based on what the court's zoning now. So you think about why doesn't Duluth grow? We hear this fairly often. And certainly there are a lot of economic trends, but part of it is just where are these things going to go without redevelopment projects, without some of these things that really take a lot of effort to get off the ground. That's significant. And then as we look at the future here, I think we're in this era where urban planning in Duluth could go in a lot of different ways. In this picture here, which is from the Duluth Waterfront Collective, which is the group that has the vision for redoing I-35 through downtown Duluth. Who knows if it'll ever look like this or something like this, but at least there's an effort at a big plan here. There's a real community conversation around this about what it could be. Is a real trend in the planning field these days is thinking about who gets to participate in discussions. I think it was historically a lot of plan decisions got made by who showed up to meetings, which is all nice and democratic, but the reality is that people who show up to meetings are not represented in the community at all. So I think there's been a reckoning around that recently. It was still needs work, but it's happening. And there's also just the reality of people are working virtually now. People are moving into this different way of being potentially and understanding what that looks like. I don't think any of us really know what that's going to shake out to be yet. Some other new trends to focus on, climate resilience, figuring out how to manage this in that way. That's been a huge topic. And you look at a city like Duluth, a lot of slopes, a lot of watersheds, there's a lot of challenges to development, and climate flows is certainly significant going forward. There's also the question of what we'll call informality. It's fascinating how much this has changed in 10 years. When I was at grad school of urban planning, we talked about this as something that happened in third world countries. And now there's been this real shift of recognizing, well, this is happening in our backyards. And there tented cameras showing up, which is certainly a function of something broken somewhere, both the market and a government response to housing. So how do you cope with the fact that people are doing their own planning? Because that's what they can do. And coming out of that, you've seen this movement to kind of rethink densifying cities, building cities up. Yes, in my backyard movement to resist the not my backyard resistance to a lot of development. Minneapolis banned single family zoning a couple of years back, which was the first city in the US to do that. It's a major movement. You have even people looking at some of the environmental regulations, especially in places like California, where things are very expensive, where you see that. Well, file these environmental lawsuits against projects, but do they actually, if they're actually a serious environmental concern? Probably not. They're just finding ways to block projects because they don't lie up there. And so there's really this change of a lot of shifting alliances, a lot of shifting coalitions, a lot of people working with people who they may not have expected to be working with on some of these questions. And you think these are where cities go from here. And I've probably gone well over 20 minutes. So just some high level takeaways for planning, something that affects everything, never has total control over everything, but it kind of places itself into all parts of cities. Basically any choice made in urban planning has some sort of trade-off going on, and the history of it is a lot of corrections for the excesses or mistakes of previous eras. And then that geography, regulation, a bunch of things that really constrain what can actually happen. So with that, I'll leave you with one flow chart, and I have to come up to see it. And if we can move on to discussion.
Thank you so much, Carl. I get to work with this guy, right? How fun is that? So next we're going to move into the next stage in this event, which is our community conversation. So what I'd like you to do is utilize those two tables right back there. So Scott's table and Zach's table. And if we could get into groups of about 5 or 6, whatever works best in that space.